The frost-covered deck of the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper creaked beneath his boots as he made his morning inspection. At 28 years old, he represented the new generation of officers, men who had never known defeat, who had been raised on stories of Jutland and the high seas fleet's glory. The air smelled of coal smoke and salt, and in the darkness before dawn, the massive ship seemed to breathe with industrial power. Ran his hand along the cold steel of the forward turret, feeling the reassuring solidity of 8.8-inch guns. This was Germany's naval future, he believed. Modern, powerful, invincible. He had no way of knowing that within 4 years, he would stand on a shattered pier and watch an American production miracle that would render everything he believed obsolete. The German naval establishment of 1940 existed in a state of confident calculation. Plan Z, initiated by Grand Admiral in January 1939, represented this blueprint for challenging British naval supremacy by 1948. The plan called for 10 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 15 battlecruisers, 5 heavy cruisers, 44 light cruisers, 68 destroyers, and 249 U-boats. It was ambitious, systematic, and based on decades of German naval tradition and engineering excellence. The mathematics seemed sound. Germany possessed the world's finest naval architects, the most disciplined construction workforce, and shipyards with centuries of experience. And his contemporaries studied British construction rates, Japanese developments, and American capabilities. They concluded that Germany could build its way to naval parity within a decade. What they never calculated was that America wasn't bound by the same rules of industrial physics that governed European production. Throughout 1940 and 1941, as Germany's surface fleet engaged in commerce raiding and occasional fleet actions, officers maintained their confidence in German industrial capacity. The Bismarck, launched in February 1939, represented everything they believed about German superiority. At 50,300 tons fully loaded, armed with 8 15-inch guns, capable of 30 knots, she was a masterpiece of engineering. When Bismarck sortied in May 1941, accompanied by the heavy cruiser, German naval officers believed they were witnessing the beginning of Germany's maritime resurgence. The destruction of HMS Hood seemed to confirm their calculations. British naval supremacy was not invincible after all. Then came the 26th and 27th of May, 1941. C. Ernst commanded Bismarck when what seemed like the entire Royal Navy converged on his position. The battleships King George V and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, cruisers, destroyers, waves of British vessels pursuing a single German ship. The intensity of British response stunned German naval observers. The Royal Navy had mobilized over 40 warships to hunt down Bismarck, not because they feared one ship, but because they could afford to deploy such overwhelming force. When Bismarck finally sank after absorbing hundreds of shells and multiple torpedoes, only 114 of her 2,221 crew survived. Among the dead was himself, who chose to go down with his ship. The lesson German naval officers took from Bismarck's fate was about British determination. What they should have learned was about industrial depth, the ability to throw overwhelming resources at a single problem without compromising overall capability. It was a lesson the Americans would teach them with devastating clarity. Survive the early war years through a combination of skill and fortune. By December 1941, he had been promoted to and assigned to the Naval High Command in Berlin, working in the Construction Planning Division. When news arrived of Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the war, and his colleagues gathered around maps and production tables, calculating America's potential contribution to Allied naval power. They knew the numbers, had studied American shipyards, understood American industrial capacity in abstract terms. Their calculations suggested that American production would matter certainly, but not decisively. American yards were building merchant ships primarily. Their naval construction, while substantial, followed traditional patterns. A destroyer took 18 months to build. A cruiser took 3 years. A battleship took 5 years or more. These were the immutable laws of naval construction, proven by decades of experience across every maritime nation. What his colleagues couldn't imagine was that America was about to rewrite those laws entirely. Throughout 1942, German naval intelligence tracked American construction with growing concern but not yet alarm. The Americans had launched several new battleships: Washington, South Dakota, Indiana, Massachusetts. Impressive vessels, certainly, but within expected parameters. They were building Essex-class aircraft carriers, large fleet carriers that would take years to complete. The first, USS Essex, was commissioned in December 1942 after nearly 2 years of construction. Everything still seemed to follow rational industrial timelines. German calculations suggested the Americans might have 8 to 10 fleet carriers by 1944, perhaps 15 by war's end. Substantial, but manageable in conjunction with Japanese naval power drawing American attention to the Pacific. Then the intelligence reports began arriving that initially dismissed as errors. In April 1943, a German intelligence summary landed on his desk detailing American escort carrier production. According to the report, America had commissioned 11 escort carriers in the first quarter of 1943 alone. Check the figures twice, assuming a transcription error. 11 carriers in 3 months. The report these were smaller vessels, converted from merchant hulls, but still 11 carriers. He cross-referenced with other intelligence sources. The numbers were accurate. The Americans were building something called Kaiser-class escort carriers at a yard in Vancouver, Washington. The construction time per vessel, 3 months. Studied the specifications with growing disbelief. These weren't makeshift conversions. They were purpose-built carriers with full flight decks, hangar bays, and operational capability. The Americans were building fleet-capable carriers faster than Germany could build destroyers. By mid-1943, the full scope of American shipbuilding capacity began revealing itself through intelligence reports, captured documents, and reconnaissance photographs. The numbers seemed to defy physical possibility. In 1943 alone, according to consolidated intelligence assessments, American yards would complete approximately 19 aircraft carriers of various types, 4 battleships, 2 large cruisers, 24 cruisers, 128 destroyers, 67 destroyer escorts, 26 submarines, and 238 various smaller combat vessels. But these warship numbers paled beside the merchant construction figures. 1,896 merchant ships in 1943, totaling 19 million tons. The famous Liberty ships were being completed at an average rate of 3 per day. Individual ships were being finished in as little as 42 days from keel laying to launch. Requested a meeting with his superior, Chief of the Naval War Staff Operations Division. In's office, surrounded by maps showing the shrinking areas of German control, presented his analysis. Herr Admiral, if these figures are accurate, we are not competing with American shipbuilding. We are being statistically eliminated from naval relevance. A veteran of the First World War who had served at Jutland studied the reports in silence. Finally, he spoke. He insists these numbers are propaganda, exaggerations designed to demoralize us. Persisted. Sir, we have photographic reconnaissance of American yards. We have captured manifests. The numbers are consistent across multiple sources. Looked at his young officer with something close to sympathy. Do you know what happens to officers who tell that Germany cannot win? The conversation ended there but continued compiling data. By late 1943, he had assembled what amounted to a statistical portrait of industrial annihilation. Germany's entire 1943 naval construction comprised 1 battleship completed, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 light cruisers, 17 destroyers, 258 U-boats, and approximately 400 smaller vessels. Impressive by any historical standard, except when compared to American production. The United States was outbuilding Germany in destroyers alone by a ratio of 7-1. In overall tonnage, accounting for merchant shipping, the ratio exceeded 20-1. But these numbers remained abstract, columns in reports, until the moment they became visible reality. That moment arrived on June 14, 1944, 8 days after D-Day. Had been transferred to Cherbourg in April 1944, assigned to coordinate naval support for German ground forces in Normandy. It was an assignment that spoke volumes about the reduced circumstances. Senior naval officers were now essentially port administrators, managing the trickle of supplies that could still reach France by sea. When the invasion came on June 6, had been at his headquarters in Cherbourg, receiving fragmented reports of massive Allied landings, of thousands of ships, of complete Allied naval dominance. Like most German officers, he initially assumed these reports were exaggerated by the chaos of battle. Thousands of ships seemed physically impossible. Even assuming every available Allied vessel had been committed, the numbers being reported exceeded every German intelligence estimate by orders of magnitude. On June 14, with American forces advancing toward Cherbourg and the city's fall inevitable, made his way to the harbor breakwater for a final inspection before the evacuation order. It was 11:23 a.m., and the weather had cleared after days of overcast skies. He climbed to the observation post at the harbor's edge, raised his binoculars, and looked northwest toward the invasion beaches 30 miles away. What he saw stopped his breath in his chest. The English Channel was not water anymore. It was steel. From horizon to horizon, stretching as far as his binoculars could resolve, ships, hundreds of ships, thousands of ships, great battleships and cruisers, their superstructures distinctive even at distance, swarms of destroyers moving in organized patterns. Massive flat-topped vessels he recognized as the Liberty ships, converted into floating supply depots. LSDs, landing ship tank, beached on every visible stretch of coastline, their bow doors open, disgorging vehicles in continuous streams. Smaller craft, LCTs, LCIs, LCVPs, moving between the larger ships and shore like insects around a hive. The sheer density of vessels created a solid visual mass. Individual ships became indistinguishable. The sea had been replaced by a floating industrial complex that stretched beyond the limits of sight. Lowered his binoculars and simply stared. 41 years old, a career naval officer, a man who had spent his adult life thinking about ships, building ships, fighting ships, and nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. This wasn't a naval armada. This was American industrial capacity made visible. Every ship represented factories, workers, resources, logistical systems. The Admiral Hipper, the ship he had served on in 1940, had represented years of planning, millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of skilled workers, irreplaceable materials. That single heavy cruiser had been a significant percentage of Germany's annual naval construction budget. What saw through his binoculars was the equivalent of dozens of Admiral Hippers, hundreds of destroyers, thousands of landing craft, and this was just what was visible from one observation point on one day. He thought of the calculations he and his colleagues had made in 1941, the careful assessments of American industrial potential. They had been mathematically correct but conceptually blind. They had calculated that America could build perhaps 5,000 ships during the course of a 4-year war, an impressive total by historical standards. What they had failed to imagine was that America would build those 5,000 ships in 18 months, then build 5,000 more. A young sea approached, saluting. "Herr, the evacuation order has been confirmed. We are to destroy all facilities and withdraw before." He stopped, following his gaze toward the sea of ships. The young officer, barely 22, stood silent for a long moment. He whispered, "How many are there?" Didn't answer immediately. He was remembering a conversation from 1940 when he and other young officers had discussed American military potential over schnapps in the wardroom. They had laughed at American military capability, mocked their limited armed forces, dismissed their industrial might as suited only for civilian products, automobiles and refrigerators, not warships. More than we can count, finally said. More than Germany could build in 10 years, more than we ever imagined possible. The evacuation from Cherbourg proceeded under the shadow of that impossible armada. German engineers demolished the port facilities with typical thoroughness, but even as they wired explosives and prepared demolitions, everyone understood the futility. American engineering capacity would repair whatever damage Germany inflicted, probably within weeks. As vehicle convoy moved inland on June 20th, American artillery shells began falling on Cherbourg. Among those shells were 14-inch rounds from the battleship USS Texas, firing from 10 miles offshore. Each shell weighed 1,500 pounds. The ship carried 100 such shells per gun, 12 guns total. One ship possessed more explosive throw weight than an entire German artillery regiment, and could fire those shells with radar-directed accuracy. And Texas was just one battleship among dozens serving in the invasion fleet. During the evacuation journey, carried with him a folder of documents, his accumulated intelligence reports on American production. At a temporary headquarters in Rennes, he showed these documents to other officers, spreading the statistical evidence across a table like cards in a grim game. The numbers told their story with mathematical clarity. By June 1944, American shipyards had completed 141 aircraft carriers of all types since Pearl Harbor. Germany had completed 0. American yards had launched 349 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Germany had launched 67 destroyers in the same period. American merchant ship production exceeded 40 million tons. Germany had managed perhaps 1.5 million tons, and most of those ships never left port due to Allied air supremacy and naval blockade. One officer who had served on U-boats in the Atlantic studied the figures and began laughing, a desperate broken sound. "We were hunting their ships one at a time," he said, "trying to sink them faster than they could build them. Do you know what our best month was? 48 ships in November 1942. We thought we were winning. We were killing perhaps 2 days' worth of their production." The room fell silent. The mathematics were irrefutable. Even at the peak of U-boat effectiveness, when wolf packs had been sinking Allied ships at record rates, Germany had never approached the sinking rates necessary to outpace American construction. To actually degrade Allied merchant capacity, U-boats would have needed to sink approximately 3 ships per day, every day, indefinitely. Even in their best months, they had achieved perhaps 1/4 of that rate, and those victories had come at staggering cost to U-boat crews. Spent the autumn of 1944 at various headquarters positions as the German military situation deteriorated from bad to catastrophic. He witnessed the systematic destruction of German forces in the pocket, the liberation of Paris, the Allied advance to the German border. Throughout this period, he continued analyzing Allied logistics, and the numbers revealed a pattern that explained the seemingly inexhaustible American offensive capability. The artificial mulberry harbors that had stunned German observers were handling 9,000 tons of supplies daily by July. When Cherbourg was captured and its port facilities repaired, a process German engineers had estimated would take 6 months, but which American engineers completed in 3 weeks, throughput increased to 12,000 tons daily. By September, with Antwerp captured and operational, Allied logistics capacity in Western Europe exceeded 40,000 tons per day. 40,000 tons daily. To put this in perspective, the entire German 7th Army in Normandy had possessed supply reserves of approximately 15,000 tons total in early June 1944. What the Allies landed in one day exceeded German reserves for an entire army. This wasn't warfare as German officers understood it. This was industrial logistics operating at a scale that transcended military categories entirely. In December 1944, found himself assigned to the Marine headquarters in Berlin, now largely relegated to managing the remnants of German naval power. That had begun the war with ambitious plans for fleet actions and commerce raiding, had been reduced to coastal defense and U-boat operations, the latter increasingly futile against Allied anti-submarine warfare that had become devastatingly effective. It was here, in the bureaucratic confines of a military high command that no longer commanded much of anything, that encountered the final statistical proof of German industrial defeat. A report from a returned POW, an engineer who had been captured in France and briefly held before being repatriated through neutral channels, contained details from conversations with American guards. The American sailors had casually mentioned that their navy now numbered over 6,000 vessels of all types. The engineer had initially dismissed this as typical American exaggeration, but upon further conversation, he had become convinced the number was accurate, possibly even conservative. 6,000 ships. The entire at its peak strength in 1940 had numbered approximately 1,300 vessels of all types, including small coastal craft. In 4 years of war, America had built a navy 4 times larger than Germany's entire pre-war fleet, while simultaneously building another navy's worth of vessels for Britain under Lend-Lease, while also constructing the largest merchant marine in human history. Presented this information at a staff meeting in January 1945. Admiral, the commander-in-chief of the, listened without expression. When finished, simply nodded. "We know," he said quietly. "We've known for some time." An uncomfortable silence followed. Finally, commanding U-boat operations spoke. "The question that haunts me is whether we ever had a chance. If we had known in 1939 what American industrial capacity would prove to be, would we have fought at all?" No one answered, because everyone in that room knew the answer. They had fought based on calculations that were reasonable, logical, and completely blind to the reality of American industrial potential. They had assumed linear progression, that American shipyards would build ships at rates comparable to British or German yards, just with more resources. What they had failed to imagine was that America would approach shipbuilding not as craftsmanship, but as mass production, applying Henry Ford's assembly line principles to vessels displacing thousands of tons. The symbolic object that came to represent this gulf in understanding was not a weapon, not a ship, not even a specific technology. It was the simple Liberty ship cargo vessel. Had first encountered detailed specifications for the Liberty ship in 1943, and he had studied them with professional interest. They were simple vessels, 441 feet long, 7,176 gross tons, capable of 11 knots, carrying 9,140 tons of cargo. The design was deliberately obsolete, reciprocating steam engines rather than modern turbines, riveted rather than welded construction initially, every system optimized for rapid production rather than elegance or efficiency. To a German naval officer trained in the traditions of precise engineering and optimal performance, Liberty ships seemed almost contemptible. They were crude, slow, inefficient by European standards. Then came the production numbers. America built 2,710 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945. The fastest construction time from keel laying to launch was 4 days and 15.5 hours, for the SS Robert E., though this was an exceptional publicity stunt. Average construction time settled around 42 days. 42 days to build a 7,000-ton cargo ship, faster than Germany could build a torpedo boat. The implications were staggering. The Liberty ship represented a philosophical approach to war that Germany had never conceptualized. These vessels were designed to be expendable. Individual ships didn't matter. If U-boats sank 100 Liberty ships, America would build 200 more. The ships were cheap, simple, and above all, numerous. They transformed logistics from an art into arithmetic. Need to transport a division to Europe. Calculate the tonnage required. Assign the appropriate number of Liberty ships, load and sail. The British Empire had spent centuries building its merchant marine. America built a larger one in 4 years. By April 1945, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin and the Reich collapsing, found himself part of the great exodus of military personnel fleeing westward, hoping to surrender to Americans or British rather than Soviets. On April 28th, he reached the Baltic coast near Kiel, where remnants of the sat at anchor, a few damaged destroyers, torpedo boats, U-boats that would never sail again. He stood on the dock, looking at these vessels that had once represented German naval power, and thought of that morning in Cherbourg when he had seen the true meaning of industrial warfare. A young sailor approached, barely 18, wearing a uniform that was too large for him, probably inherited from a deceased or captured comrade. "Herr, is it true the Americans have thousands of ships?" The boy's voice carried desperate hope, as if the answer might somehow change Germany's fate. Nodded slowly. "More than thousands, more than we ever imagined possible." The sailor looked out at the gray Baltic waters. "Then we never had a chance, did we?" It was not really a question. Was captured by British forces on May 3, 1945, and spent 2 years in a POW camp in Scotland before repatriation. During those years, he had access to Allied newspapers and magazines, and he read them voraciously, particularly anything concerning wartime production. He learned that American aircraft production had exceeded 300,000 aircraft during the war, that American tank production had reached 88,000 vehicles, that American truck production, trucks, the unglamorous foundation of logistics, had exceeded 2.3 million vehicles. He read that at peak production, American shipyards were launching a major warship every 2 days and completing one Liberty ship every 8 hours. He encountered a statistic that seemed to capture everything. In 1944 alone, American production exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy for the entire war. The transformation in its understanding was complete but not unique. German officers who had witnessed Allied industrial power in action underwent similar philosophical revolutions. They had been taught that warfare was about strategy, tactics, courage, military tradition. These things mattered, certainly, but they were rendered largely irrelevant by sufficient material superiority. A brilliantly executed defense could not withstand unlimited artillery shells. Elite troops could not compete against unlimited replacements. Traditional military virtues, bravery, discipline, tactical skill, meant little when the enemy could simply overwhelm every position with industrial firepower. Returned to Germany in 1947, finding a nation physically and psychologically shattered. He settled in Hamburg, took a position with a shipping company, and spent the next decades in the maritime industry. He rarely spoke of his wartime service, but in 1969, at age 66, he was invited to contribute to a historical symposium on naval warfare. His presentation focused on a single question: how had German naval intelligence so completely failed to assess American industrial potential? His answer was uncomfortable. "We measured America by German standards," he said. "We calculated how long it took us to build a ship and assumed American construction would follow similar timelines. We knew America was larger, wealthier, more populous, so we our construction rates by factors we considered reasonable. 3 times our capacity, perhaps 5 times at most." What we failed to understand was that America would approach warship construction the way they approached automobile manufacturing. They didn't build ships, they manufactured them. He paused, gathering his thoughts. "In 1940, I walked the deck of the Admiral Hipper and felt proud of German engineering. That ship represented years of planning, millions in investment, skilled craftsmen working for months. It was a masterpiece. Then in 1944, I stood at Cherbourg and watched an endless stream of American ships, crude, simple, hastily built, and I understood that my beautiful Admiral Hipper was irrelevant. They could build 10 ships in the time it took us to build one, and if we sank 5 of theirs, they would build 20 more." The epilogue to his story came in 1974, when he was invited to the United States for the first time, part of a NATO-related exchange program. At age 71, he flew to California and visited the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, where 747 ships had been constructed during the war, including 18 aircraft carriers. The yards were much reduced from their wartime scale, but portions remained operational. Walked through facilities that had once employed 90,000 workers, that had launched ships at rates that seemed impossible even now, 30 years later. He stood at the edge of one of the massive construction ways and tried to reconcile what he saw with his memories of German shipyards, the careful, precise, time-intensive work that had characterized European naval construction. An American engineer, learning of his background, asked him what he thought. The old German officer looked out over the vast industrial space and spoke slowly. In Germany, we built ships like we built cathedrals. Each one was a masterpiece, irreplaceable, precious. You built ships like you built automobiles. Standardized, mass-produced, expendable. We thought our approach was superior. We were wrong. The engineer nodded. We did the same thing with tanks, aircraft, everything. Maybe it wasn't elegant, but it worked, smiled faintly. That's the lesson we learned too late. In industrial warfare, good enough in quantity defeats perfect in scarcity. That evening, at a dinner with American and German naval historians, someone asked about the moment he truly understood Germany would lose. He was quiet for a long moment, remembering that June morning in Cherbourg, the binoculars trembling in his hands, the impossible sea of steel stretching to every horizon. June 14th, 1944, he said finally. I stood at Cherbourg harbor and looked at the invasion fleet. Not just ships, a physical manifestation of what freedom and prosperity can accomplish when fully mobilized. We had been told that democracies were weak, divided, incapable of sustained military effort. What I saw that morning proved the opposite. Those thousands of ships represented something we had never possessed, the industrial output of a free society that had chosen to fight. Died in 1979 at age 76. In his papers, his family found a worn folder containing his wartime reports on American production, the documents he had carried through the evacuation from Cherbourg. On the last page, in handwriting that appeared to be from much later, perhaps the 1960s, he had written a single paragraph. We were defeated by Liberty ships and Sherman tanks, by P-51 fighters and C-47 transports. Simple, crude, mass-produced weapons that overwhelmed our superior engineering through sheer abundance. The lesson for future generations. In modern war, industrial capacity is military capacity. A nation that can produce unlimited material will defeat a nation of limited resources, regardless of tactical brilliance or strategic genius. We learned this lesson while watching 7,000 ships approach Normandy. Others should learn it from our defeat. The German officers who witnessed Allied industrial power in 1944 and 1945 were forever changed by the experience. They had entered the war believing in the superiority of German engineering, training, and military tradition. They emerged understanding that these advantages meant nothing against overwhelming material superiority produced by industrial systems operating at scales they had never imagined possible. The symbolic power of that moment at Cherbourg, when first saw the full extent of Allied naval power, lay not in any single vessel but in the totality. The endless horizon of ships representing resources, organization, industrial capacity, and yes, the economic output of free societies that had been underestimated at Germany's peril. The Liberty ship, that crude, simple cargo vessel built in shipyards that looked more like automobile factories than traditional naval yards, became the emblem of this industrial truth. Not impressive individually, devastating in aggregate. Not elegant in design, revolutionary in production methodology. Not symbols of naval tradition, but harbingers of warfare's industrial future. When German officers calculated that America built one Liberty ship every 8 hours at peak production, they understood they were fighting not a military campaign, but an industrial equation they could never solve. The mathematics of defeat sailed toward Germany in those thousands of simple, standardized ships, each one representing American industrial capacity made tangible, freedom's productive power unleashed, democracy's latent strength revealed. The sea of ships that haunted until his death was more than an invasion fleet. It was the visible manifestation of a truth about modern warfare that Germany had refused to accept until too late. That productive capacity equals military capacity, that quantity has a quality all its own, that industrial systems optimized for mass production will overwhelm industrial systems optimized for perfection. In the endless rows of Liberty ships, in the horizon-spanning armada at Normandy, in the continuous stream of American vessels flowing across both oceans, German officers confronted the reality that their elegant, precisely engineered warships were relics of an earlier era. They had brought 19th-century assumptions about warfare to a 20th-century industrial conflict, and they paid for that miscalculation with absolute, mathematically inevitable defeat. The final lesson, written in steel across the waters of the English Channel on June 6, 1944, was this: industrial warfare favors not the nation with the best weapons, but the nation that can produce adequate weapons in unlimited quantities. America's wartime production was not technically superior to Germany's in most categories. American tanks were generally inferior to German tanks in armor and firepower. American aircraft were often less sophisticated than German designs. American naval vessels followed conventional designs, while Germany experimented with revolutionary technologies. But America built 88,000 tanks to Germany's 67,000. America built 300,000 aircraft to Germany's 119,000. America built 6,000 naval vessels to Germany's few hundred. And in that quantitative superiority lay qualitative transformation, the birth of industrial warfare on a scale that rendered traditional military considerations obsolete. Understood this on June 14, 1944, standing at Cherbourg with binoculars raised toward an impossible armada. What he saw was not defeat in any traditional military sense. What he saw was mathematical elimination, industrial annihilation, the physical proof that Germany had challenged a productive system it could never hope to match. The image that haunted him, ships from horizon to horizon, steel replacing water American industrial might made visible, was the image of warfare's future, where battles would be won not on fields but in factories, where victory would belong not to the bravest soldiers but to the most productive societies, where the side that could manufacture the most would overwhelm the side that manufactured the best. It was a lesson written in the wake of 7,000 ships approaching Normandy, taught by Liberty ships and LSDs and destroyers and carriers and cruisers and battleships, an endless industrial stream flowing from American shipyards, carrying with it the inevitable victory of productive democracy over resource-constrained autocracy. German officers who witnessed this lesson never forgot it. Neither should history.